Lexi, what were some of your influences when you were writing Eternal Descent?
Well, fun enough, I mean, there's a whole load of stuff with Eternal Descent. Obviously, it's very much rooted in heavy metal lore and mythology, but it's also very much rooted in fantasy lore and that mythology and also biblical stuff. So you've got this kind of all this kind of Dante's Inferno influences and the sort of Divine Comedy and all of that, but then you also have all the classic, heavy metal stuff, and it's evident from Volume 1 that many people might be familiar with. That obviously we've drawn from bands like Static X and Ozzy Osbourne and these kind of acts for content from their lyrics that we've sort of translated into narrative. From a comic book point of view, a lot of 90s stuff, Jim Lee's X-Men, Dave Finch's Ascension, which was short-lived but absolutely gorgeous graphically, and certainly the inspiration for a lot of the winged figures in our comics. So yeah, that's a broad cross-section.
So tell me a bit more about the main characters, Lara and Syrian.
Sure, I mean the series really pivots around Lyra. She's quite a conflicted individual, and she has these inner demons that are kind of slowly consuming her, and as they manifest themselves, so do her powers and her mutations, and she sort of becomes this more demonic entity. Syrian, on the other hand, is kind of a fallen angel type anti-hero, and he kind of discovers Lyra's plight and sort of figuratively and literally takes her under his wing and sort of protects her, but also trains her. She sort of becomes his pupil in the way of controlling her powers and being able to sort of use them for just causes rather than giving in to the dark side.
So what about the big cheese, Loki?
I think Loki is like the ultimate in kind of Machiavellian villains. He's a real plotter, he's a real schemer. As his namesake, he kind of takes on that name from, it's not actually his name, and as we refer to in the comic, his real name is of hellish origin and far too long to even be pronounced. So the Loki thing was really a nod to that mythology, and even him, and it even says in the comic, oh, he probably got the name from an album cover somewhere. So that's kind of a laugh, but he certainly does embody that mischievous, scheming character.
So how did you approach getting real-life musicians to appear in the series?
Well, I'm very fortunate to have always kind of worked in the sort of sphere of music as a professional guitarist, and so a lot of these guys I encountered at trade shows, or I'd worked with them on productions, and so when I made this choice to sort of combine my two passions, which was music and guitar, specifically guitar, and obviously comics, which I'd grown up reading and loving, and animation and all of that, and I wanted to merge the two and create this comic series that was rooted in music. And so I reached out to a lot of the people I knew and all the people I'd met and said, look, I'm doing this thing, do you think it'd be cool? Would you like to get involved? And overwhelmingly the response was like, yeah, that does sound really cool, why the hell not? And I think because it's been a completely independent thing and it's been done for the love of the art, and I only reach out to artists I know and enjoy, they've always been very receptive, and so I've been very fortunate to work with some fantastic talent.
So, I mean, my impression is that you've used some of the old cliches and stereotypes that are sort of associated with heavy metal, but played them completely straight. Would you agree? Or
yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of great mythology and imagery associated with heavy metal that is very easy to sort of parody, and that's very common in pop culture. When people think, oh, let's do a heavy metal video game or let's do a heavy metal cartoon, it ends up being a comedy, and there's nothing wrong with that, and there's some great quality media out there that a lot of people are familiar with. But I wanted to do something a bit different, where I wanted to take that heavy metal mythology and actually create a strong driving narrative with character development, and characters that actually meant something to people. And so rather than sort of make fun of the heavy metal thing, I used it to create their very essence, and so it's played very straight, but it really makes these characters who they are, and it makes the world what it is, and what it why it ticks, because it is a heavy metal world rooted in that mythos.
So, Cobalt, the backup feature in Volume 2, it's really quite interesting. Like, are you looking to expand it to another title, or maybe just establish kind of Eternal Descent universe in a way?
Yeah, I wanted to introduce another character in Volume 2, and then I also had another plot for Volume 2 that was kind of this almost galaxy-spanning epic in its own right, where, Syrian has disappeared without giving too much away, and Lyra's going after him, what's happening in the broader sense, but it spans the cosmos, and it's a huge story in its own right, and also the return of Loki and where he's been at since the end of Volume 1. And so, with that in mind, I decided with Cobalt, who I also wanted to introduce, as I say, to sort of put him in a backup story, so I could still get him into the comics, but without convoluting the main epic, if you will, too much. But what's going to happen is at the end of that backup story, his kind of timeline and his location lines up with the other characters as Volume 2 ends. And so you'll see that the Cobalt story resolves with him entering the main universe.
Awesome. So, I understand you're taking Eternal Descent beyond music and comics. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Sure. Some of you may have seen our 2-minute animated short, which you can possibly link to in this video. And that's a character test that we've done for an animated pilot that we're working on with a company called Calabash Animation. So we are developing it as an animated series for TV, and that's an ongoing production, which is again creator owned, just like the comics and everything else we've done. Another thing we're doing, which will have a more imminent release, is a video game, which is for iOS, so iPad and iPhone, and also the PlayStation Vita platform will follow shortly after. And that's a collaboration with a company called PLA Games. You can look them up. And we're sort of collaborating on that directly. You know, they're handling all the development and the code side of it. The Eternal Descent team are handling all the music and the art, and it should be a really fantastic title. And hopefully, we'll see that either end of this year or very early next year.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the upcoming album. Would you say it serves as a score to the comic?
Yeah, I think. As some of you might have heard from the score that comes with the Volume 1 book, there's kind of a sort of 15-minute epic that comes with that. And that's very much kind of, the first movement, if you will, of this eventual album that really follows the story of the comic and kind of tries to tell the story through music. And so it's very dramatic, and there's lots of ups and downs and fast and slows, and, it's a very progressive piece. But I think it really encapsulates the mood of Eternal Descent, and the characters as well are represented through sound and through melody, and that's something I really enjoy doing. So certainly it is like a soundtrack to the comic, and is always intended to be not like a score, not like a background, but almost storytelling through a different medium.
So I also hear you got some big names contributing to it.
Well, yeah, I mean, to the album, or well, much like in the comic, without saying too much, a lot of the guys that you will have seen in the comic, you will hear on the album, and you will see in the game. And there's guys like Billy Sheehan from Mr. Big, guys like Gus G from Ozzy Osbourne. They're sort of happy to be named at this stage because they're involved in a lot of stuff we do and a lot of stuff that's already out there. And I think the other names will keep under wraps. But certainly, we've had the pleasure of working with some incredible musicians like Joe Satriani recently. And there's a couple of other cool guys that we're working with on the game that haven't been involved in the other stuff, so that's going to be new, fresh talent that we're working with. And so Eternal Descent continues to expand and continues to act as a platform for the world of guitar and the world of heavy metal to come into other media.
So some of the gear you use appears in the comics. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I've always been a guitarist, and I was doing that in a professional capacity, and I had a great relationship with a lot of the companies that provide this gear. And Lyra's guitar in the comics is my guitar. I have this custom shop ESP F-Series Forest guitar in purple, and that was the inspiration for Lyra's guitar. And there's photos of it floating around online where you see there's some girls cosplaying as Lyra, and they've got my guitar. That guitar literally is Lyra's guitar, and so that kind of spawned this relationship I have with ESP, where ESP have done some guitars with graphics as limited editions, and various models of ESPs have appeared in the comics, and artist signature models have been done accurately and things like that. And generally when we do amps in the comics, they're Marshall amps, because I've always used Marshall amps, Marshall cabs. And so yeah, those kind of how those relationships have been formed, and they continue to this day.
So who would you say your musical influences are?
It's very, very broad. I mean, everything from kind of, Rachmaninoff, Beethoven, Chopin, the real romantic, guys, right the way through to, the typical kind of guitar virtuosos, the Joe Satrianis, the Paul Gilberts, the Yngwie Malmsteens, and then just a huge cross-section of rock and metal, certainly in Eternal Descent influences, but then also, all kinds of music, electronic music, flamenco, ambient electronica, and then obviously a lot of soundtrack music, guys like, Hans Zimmer, James Newton Howard, there's loads of tremendous film scores out there that obviously play into this because it's got a very cinematic scope to it.
And just a final question then, what were your favourite comics growing up?
I think I'd have to say my favorite growing up was probably the X-Men. You know, I love the mutant books, and I was big into them, and for a long time. And fun enough, these days I don't read so much of it because the X-Men's so convoluted now that I have no idea what's going on, to be completely honest. But growing up, you know, as a child of the 90s, you know, that era of the X-Men I think was fantastic, and I greatly enjoyed it. And I went back as well and read a lot of the 80s X-Men books and really enjoyed them too. And then my other favorite, both character and series, has always been the Silver Surfer, and I always come back to that. And I think there's a lot of the Silver Surfer's personality in Syrian.